overeducated, underskilled. Maybe it's the other way around, I forget. And I'm obsolete. I'm not economically viable.
Welcome to the podcast of Postmodern Madness and Societal Decay. Not economically viable. With your entropy coordinator and spirit guide Jay Swift.
Greetings, comrades. It's your entropy coordinator Jay Swift. Once more, welcome you to a new installment of the podcast/vodcast of Postmodern Madness and Societal Decay. You know, we've had a lot of great guests in the program, but today's subject might just be the biggest catch yet for not economically viable. We're here to talk about his new project, Red Utopia. It's world-famous Dutch photographer Jan Banning, whose latest work takes a look at the last remaining vestiges of communism in places like Nepal, Italy, and of course, Russia herself. So, what does modern communist ideology entail in this, the great gilded age of globalized mega-capitalism? Well, let's send it straight to Jan to find out. Alright everyone, welcome to another edition of Not Economically Viable, the podcast and vodcast, of course, of Postmodern Madness and Societal Decay. And today we have not only one of the best guests we could possibly have for the program, but someone who has been a huge figure in my own professional life as a writer. Someone who I think is not only one of the premier photographers and videographers on the planet, but someone I have the luxury of calling a really good friend. Ladies and gentlemen, here on the program today, Mr. Jan Banning. And Jan, I'll just throw it over to you and allow you to introduce yourself. Tell us about your career, your projects, and your magnum opus.
Okay, hi James. Nice to talk to you. I guess it's good to say that I studied history before I became an artist, a photographer mainly. And I think that has strongly influenced my work. But before I get into that, let me give you some examples of what I have been doing. I think a lot of it has to do with matters of power, the division between those in power and the powerless, but also the paradoxes or the contradictions maybe. So chronologically, the last, 15 years or so, I did a project about former slave laborers under the Japanese occupation. So it's called Traces of War, and the subtitle is Survivors of the Burma and the Sumatra Railway. People may be familiar with the Burma Railway. The Sumatra Railway was a similar project set up by the Japanese for different reasons, military reasons, economic reasons, during the Second World War, so in places that were under Japanese occupation. Burma, Thailand, Indonesia. And I photographed and interviewed people who survived the really hard circumstances under which they were working there in the jungle. You have to imagine that there were also Americans working there, British, Australians. I focused on the Dutch and the Indonesian workers there, and of the I think of the Americans, somewhat over 20% of the people who worked there died, and compare that to the Indonesians or the local workers. In the case of the Burma Railway, about 50% of them died. And in the case of the Sumatra Railway, of the 100,000 slaves, indigenous slaves, so Indonesian workers that were transported and forced to work on this railroad, of these 100,000, about 80,000 died. So you can imagine how that was. And for me, there was a personal aspect in it, because my father worked on the Sumatra Railway, and my grandfather on the Burma Railway. They were both families, my father's and my mother's family, were living in what at that time was not Indonesia, but the Dutch East Indies. It was a colony. And they were captured, you could say, by the Japanese and made to work there. So there was this personal starting point. And I was mainly interested in finding out how the experiences from that time had influenced the later life of these people. So it was not so much a reconstruction of what had happened to them, but mainly how what had happened to them had defined their later life. I'm not sure if it's a good idea to describe how I photographed them. What do you think? I think you know the project, James, don't you?
Oh, I do, but our millions of listeners and viewers out there may be unaware.
Yeah, but should I describe it briefly?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah? Okay. So, like I said, I interviewed them and I photographed them in that order. And the photographs are basically all the same. They're portraits of men with bare torsos. And the reason for photographing them that way is that is how they were working. Not because they were in a kind of holiday camp, but coming there with only one pair of clothes and then carrying heavy and rough pieces of wood to build this railway or metal, how do you call that, these metal rails, the tracks, is not exactly good for your clothes. So after a very short time, there was nothing left of the clothes. They were dressing themselves in a piece of burlap or a piece of rubber or whatever they could find, and for the most part they were naked. So that's how I photographed them, and that was important for me because, like I said, the project was about how the experiences from that period, from the Second World War, had influenced their later lives. And I wanted to visualize this kind of a bridge between the past and the present. So in the photographs, you see the men as they are now, or at least as they were when I did the project between the year 2000 and 2003. But dressed, or rather undressed, as they were during the Second World War. So I thought that was an interesting metaphor, and it also focuses on the bodies of these people, and of course the suffering was partly a bodily suffering, partly also a mental suffering, clearly. Okay, so that is an example of a project. The one that I finished in 2003. If you have any comments, any questions on that, just let me hear that. Otherwise, I just go on with another project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things that I really admire and appreciate about your work, and I don't know if it's something you pick up on, is that when I look at your photography, I always notice that it seems to sort of incorporate this sort of dual message, to where you have the subject and you have the space around them and how they both sort of impact one another. So is that something that you try to, consciously incorporate into your work?
Well, you're right. In a lot of cases, that's how it is. Not always. The way I work is I think quite conceptual, in the sense that I start with contents and I go about the contents as a scientist would do. I think that's an example of where my education as a student of history comes in. So I read a lot, I make sure I'm well documented, and then I try to translate that into images. And in the case of Traces of War that we are discussing now, I thought it was important to have some surroundings to kind of suggest the surroundings that they had around them at the time, so during the Second World War and the period of slavery. And I have been trying all kinds of materials, and in the end I decided to use some really coarse burlap jute, because that had this suggestion of these rough circumstances in it. So yeah, I think that contributed to the impact of the photographs.
And before we get into Red Utopia, I want to quickly take a look at some of your other projects, specifically Bureaucracy and Down and Out in the South. Can you tell us a little bit more about those works?
Well, Bureaucracy is actually called Bureaucratics.
Oh my goodness, my apologies.
That's okay, no problem. It is about bureaucracy, and to be more specific, it's about bureaucracy in 8 countries worldwide. So on all continents except from Antarctica. I left out the penguin bureaucrats and except from Australia. But some examples: China, France, but also Yemen, Bolivia, and the U.S., specifically Texas. And what I did there was I photographed bureaucrats, so state servants, members of the executive, policemen, tax collectors, people who worked for market services, well, anything that is related to the state, in their surroundings, in their natural habitat, if that's how you want to call it. And I thought that was interesting because in its banal way, it is an expression of the power of the state. Or to be more specific, I think the bureaucracy is kind of the shopping window of the state. It's the place where the state and its citizens meet. And the state presents itself most clearly, most intimately maybe, through its bureaucrats. And given the fact that I'm so interested in these matters of power and powerlessness, this seemed like a very interesting approach to me. So what I did, I traveled through these countries after getting permissions, and that sounds easy, and it was a nightmare. There were literally thousands of emails going one way or the other, telephone calls, etc., etc., etc. And once because I did this together with the writer, managed to get the permission, we drove off basically and drove along these offices, and whenever we entered a bureaucratic office that seemed interesting to me, the writer would immediately start to interview this person for different reasons, but one reason was to make sure that this bureaucrat would not change his office, would not start cleaning it or making it look nicer or whatever. I wanted to have this natural habitat. And there's a lot of irony in the work, I think. And I think one thing that is interesting to say that is important to say is, in spite of the irony and the humor, I'm not trying to make a fool of these people. I may be not, let's say, the biggest fan of bureaucracy, but that doesn't mean that I want to judge the people who work there. I try to have an open approach in this project as in others. The funny thing was that a lot of these bureaucrats kind of had pity on me. In their opinion, for example, in, let's say, Liberia, Bolivia also, I think, a successful photographer does this. He photographs girls in bikinis on beaches. And for them, me having this terrible fate of having to photograph bureaucrats was clear proof of me being a total loser. So this sometimes made it easier because I was harmless, and well, let's say it also made it funny sometimes.
All right, and of course, I really can't talk about Jan Bannon without talking about the work that we've done in the past. I've been fortunate enough to work with you on 2 projects. I actually wrote the foreword to Down and Out in the South for you, and we worked together on what can only be considered a disastrous production called Rural America After the Recession. So, do you have any fond recollections of those?
Well, actually, I do have even nice recollections of the project that we did on poverty in the countryside, because for me it was fascinating. Even though a lot of people were hesitant to cooperate, hesitant to open their doors for us, there were still people who did that, and I think it gave me some more insight in a country that is not mine. After all, I'm from the Netherlands. I'm not from the US and not from Georgia. So this, I think, somehow deepened my knowledge. As for Down and Out in the South, well, in a way you could say the same thing. And what I did for Down and Out in the South was, as you know, but the listeners won't know, I portrayed, all in all, probably about 100 homeless people in 3 different states and at 3 different demographic levels. I started off when I was offered an artist in residency in Columbia, South Carolina, which I consider to be like let's say a mid-sized southern town, city. And after that, I thought it was interesting to expand that in Georgia, but then pick the southern capital, Atlanta. And the third part was in the Mississippi Delta, which is like yet another state and a more rural area. And what I did was I photographed homeless people in a studio setting. And I wanted to get away as far as possible from the classical visual approach of homeless people. I think that generally they are presented as the other, as someone else, as not you, me, or other middle class, upper class, or whatever people. And I am convinced that the distance between a homeless person and a non-homeless, how are we going to call them, a normal person, if that's what you want to say, is not that big at all. It's a matter of luck or bad luck more than anything else. And of course here, we probably get to that when we talk about Utopia, in this neoliberal system that we have been living in for a couple of decades now, there's this illusion that if you work really hard and you do what you can, then your life will be a success. I don't believe that. I think it's nonsense. It is sheer luck if you are born with a good intelligence. It's sheer luck if you are born from parents who take care of you and are able to take care of you. It is sheer luck if you were born without any mental problems, any mental diseases, etc., etc., etc. So what I did was I asked these homeless people to join me in an improvised studio, and I photographed them as I would photograph, well, any other person really, as I would photograph, let's say, a businessman who would give me an assignment. So nice light, beautiful light, and that way focusing on who this person is and not so much on what he or she is. And again, as with Traces of War that we discussed earlier, I first of all interviewed them because I also want to understand what is this? How, the basic question for me was, how did you become homeless? What has happened in your life that has made you homeless? And after these conversations, I photographed them. And, we turned that into a book. I'm saying we because, as you said, you did the introduction. You wrote the introduction, beautiful introduction. And, we turned it into a book and an exhibition, which has been exhibited in several places.
All right, and before we dovetail into Red Utopia, just a quick thing I wanted to tell you. I've been meaning to tell you this forever. Most of the people on the internet, they know me for being like a pop culture satire writer, so I live pretty much a triple, quadruple life. So not a lot of people know I'm actually like a real reporter, a real journalist. I've been doing that for like 7 years. And the absolute best thing that I've ever done in my life, not just a professional writer, but I think just as a human being, was that Rural America project. I've never been proud of anything I've done in my life. And it couldn't have been completed without your help. And I'm always going to appreciate you for being there for me.
Well, James, that's very nice of you to say, but I think the truth is I couldn't have done it without your help, not the other way around, because I remember that your text was ready. And when I first met the editor-in-chief, this was one of the first things that he mentioned to me, that this was such a fantastic article and he wanted to show it to me, and he was wondering if I would be willing to photograph it. And I read it and I thought it was a marvelous, marvelous, marvelous text. So, and then I started to photograph with your help. So you're not doing yourself justice. It's nice of you to say so, but I'm the one to say thank you.
Well, we'll just pat each other on the back for a while.
Yeah, okay.
And now, of course, we're going to turn our attention towards Red Utopia, which is your latest gallery and book that's come out late last year. Before we get into Red Utopia and the scope of the project, I think it's always interesting to kind of evaluate and compare and contrast our experiences during the Cold War. You got a few years on me. You grew up in the Netherlands. I grew up in Atlanta. When the Cold War ended in 1989, I was like 4 years old. It's kind of weird, like one of my earliest childhood memories is actually watching the Berlin Wall fall during an episode of Jeopardy. And that's never like left my mind. So yeah, just obviously, you know, the American perspective on the Cold War and communism versus capitalism, I'm assuming is quite different from yours. So just in the 1980s, you were there. What was it like being a Dutch citizen during the whole Cold War phenomenon?
Good question. Well, I think communism was much farther away probably in the US than it was for us. And I don't mean just physically, geographically, but also we had a communist party in the Netherlands. There were communist parties in Belgium, in a lot of Western countries. In fact, in Italy, in the mid-70s, the Communist Party had 35% of the votes. So it was part of life, and probably because it was closer to us, I guess it was less threatening. The stranger something is, the more threatening it can be. It wasn't that threatening. And in the 1980s, I went, so before the fall of the wall, I went to several communist countries. Also on a holiday, I took my son, who at the time was probably 10 years old or so, on my motorbike, and we went to Hungary. We went to the German Democratic Republic, so East Germany, to Czechoslovakia, and of course it was different, and it was not exactly they were not exactly places where I would want to live, but it was clear that it was livable, if that's the word, for a lot of people. I became good friends with a couple of photographers in East Germany, And in a lot of situations, you did not really notice that much of the political pressure. And these people often had what they call dachas, so a small house outside of the city, living in Berlin, but they had like 100 kilometers, so 70 miles outside of Berlin. They had a small home, and officially I was not allowed to go there, so what happened was you traveled up there, had to go to the police station, and had to say where you were staying. And since you couldn't stay with private people, you said, I'm staying at the campsite. And then you took off, and I just stayed in their place, and nobody ever checked the campsite if we were staying there or not. So in practice, like I said, I wouldn't want to live there, but it was less weird and strange than probably people who've never been there would expect. And it was, why did I not want to live there? Well, clearly the lack of freedom in the sense of it's not easy to get access to information as I could get it in the Netherlands. The freedom of expression was not exactly really great. But another aspect was that there was little real poverty. There was certainly very little wealth. I think only for the party leadership. But everybody could get an education. Often not bad, I have to say. Not a bad education. People had a job. A lot of these jobs were almost fake jobs, were not doing much, but they had an income. They had free healthcare. So it was, in that sense, tolerable, as long as you didn't have too high ambitions. And me being a person who has had a high education, an artist, and having high ambitions, it would not be my kind of life. But I think for a lot of ordinary workers, it wasn't the worst kind of life.
And of course, Red Utopia came out 100 years after the October Revolution. So what was the general premise and origin point of Red Utopia? Where did the inspiration for the project come from?
A couple of things. A historical aspect. This communist ideology has been of a tremendous world influence since, let's say, roughly the second half of the 19th century, up until 1989, and then it collapsed, and it seems as if it disappeared vanished into thin air, which is kind of strange for something that has been so important for about a century. So I was wondering, has it really disappeared? Has it really vanished into thin air? Let me investigate that. And then not just investigate, let's say, online and finding out where there are still communist parties active and sometimes even big. But what would they look like? I mean, this is documentary photography, so I went out to photograph not what we have normally seen of communism, demonstrations, masses of red flags, speeches by Lenin with huge audiences, etc. I was interested in, let's say, the intimate life of these parties, so their offices where nothing big is happening, the boring side of it. Anyway, so that was one. This historical aspect was one thing, and the other was that I was also surprised that, look, since the fall of the wall, and shortly before that, apparently there was no need anymore to keep capitalism in check. or to put it differently, I think communism has not been a clear blessing for the people who were living under communism, but it certainly was a blessing for us outside of the communist world, because somehow there was always this potential competition of another ideology which kind of softened up capitalism. And there was always in major parts of Europe this kind of social democratic tendency to simplify it. Politics took care of the poor. And once communism disappeared, that seemed to be unnecessary, and the gap between rich and poor expanded widely. It was not held in check anymore. So that also motivated me. I also thought, if I managed to bring up this old ideology into the public debate, it may stimulate people to think about alternatives for this jungle capitalism, this unchecked form of capitalism. Not in the sense that I'm making propaganda for communism. It's not exactly my ideal, but it might make people think about alternatives and ask themselves the question, my goodness, we would need a more egalitarian ideology or society now under these circumstances.
And were there any countries or organizations that denied you entry for the project?
Yeah, more or less they did. Yeah. The Portuguese Central Committee, Communist Central Committee, kicked me out after my first visit. I was not welcome back, and they never explained why, but I think I can safely guess why, and that must be that they wanted something heroic. And if you look at these photographs, it's anything but heroic. In some cases, certainly the iconography that you see in the photographs is heroic, but in such an office, it all looks a bit clumsy. It's not great. I think their idea was that it was not positive for their image. So yeah, they denied it, and I've been struggling with the South African Communist Party for about a year, and in the end I decided not to go because it was clear they wanted to fully control me, and they were going to decide what I could photograph and what I couldn't, and that was not the idea. I I need my freedom to visualize what I want to visualize.
Okay, and at the final tally, you got footage from India, Italy, Nepal, Portugal, Russia. And I guess the big question there is, how did their perspectives and interpretations of what communism is differ?
Oh, hugely. Let's take what, in my opinion, were the two extremes. On the one hand, Russia. If you look at Russia now, I think it is much more similar to the US than a lot of Americans like to think, in the sense that this jungle capitalism is as strong in Russia as it is in the US. It's probably more corrupt in Russia, etc., etc. But I mean, the lack of care, or let's say sacrificing public space in its widest sense to the advantage of private wealth, is very visible in both countries. And that had consequences, I think, for the Russian communists. So I've traveled about 5,000 kilometers in Western Russia and visited over 50 offices together with a translator. And what kept on coming back was that enthusiasm for Stalin. And of course, for somebody who knows a little bit about history, that is kind of hard to imagine. So if, again, some communist member in one of these small towns started to praise Stalin, my translator and I would come up with a comment like, hey, there was a bit of repression, wasn't there? I mean, after all, there were millions of victims of Stalinism. And they would basically deny it. They would say like, yeah, well, every country has some problems, and yeah, you have to realize there was a lot of sabotage at that time, etc., etc., or, oh, it's been hugely exaggerated. And I found it very annoying and irritating, and I was angry about that. But I think after a while I started to understand why they said it. Not that I agreed, but it became clear to me that for them, they were not old enough to have consciously lived through the worst period of Stalinism, the 1930s. So for them, imagine, remember, this is Western Russia. This is where the Second World War was fought. So for them, Stalin was the big liberator who liberated either them or their parents from fascism, from Nazi Germany. So he was a war hero, first of all. And secondly, life may not have been very glorious under communism and under Stalin, but it's strange to say, but for people who were not really against the regime, for the people, these kind of people in the small towns, it was safe. Safe, as I said earlier, in fact, they had a job, they could get an education. If they were sick, they could get free healthcare. And they knew that if they would just work, or at least be at that job for the rest of their lives, they would get retirement money, a pension, and it would be enough to live on, and they would be living there with their children, with modest income, etc., etc., but it would be safe and secure. And now, since Gorbachev and Yeltsin, all that is gone. If they're sick, they have to pay. They can't just go to a doctor. They have to pay. Education, you have to pay. There's no work, so their children leave these towns to find work in Moscow or St. Petersburg or any other big city. Their retirement money is worth nothing. Their roads are terrible. Their houses are crumbling. And so they have a huge nostalgia to these safe and secure days of communism, and especially of Stalin. So that was the Russian perspective. The extreme opposite, I think, was Italy, where the Communist Party is much smaller. They don't even have any seats in parliament anymore, whereas the Russians get like 12-13% at the elections. The Italian Communist Party, at least the biggest one, if that's the word you can use, the Rifondazione, Partito Rifondazione Comunista, was like an interesting mix of some really old partisans, freedom fighters from the Second World War, some environmental activists, feminists, slow food movement people. So this kind of a mix. Stalin was absolutely not. Well, they had wanted to have nothing to do with Stalin, and interestingly enough, at a practical level for me, Italy was the only country where I did not, let's say, cover in one take. I tried to do that in Portugal, but as I said, I was not allowed to return. In the other countries, I did it all at once. In Italy, it was divided over several trips. The consequence is that, of course, people asked to receive their photographs, so I had to send those. And it struck me that the Italians had a very liberal, free attitude to that. Well, remember, as I said, in the 1970s, the Communist Party in Italy was huge. It was the biggest communist party outside of the communist bloc. 35% of the population voted for it, and a lot of artists, writers, filmmakers, etc., were members of the Communist Party. So it had a completely different atmosphere, and that seems to have been inherited by this present Communist Party. So they were absolutely not bothered by my photographs. I think, in their opinion, this is the work of an artist, and artists do what they want to do. They are being respected. Artists are respected, and they had a very free attitude, I think. So it's really difficult to. No, you cannot say that the communists in one country are really similar to the communists in other countries. In Nepal, there is a strong Maoist party. Now Mao for the Italians, at least for the Rifondazione, is like a completely outrageous, ridiculous person. They want to have nothing to do with. So there's a whole, there are differences, big differences.
And just looking at your documents there, your photography, and just looking at some of these organizations online, it seems like modern communism, we've seen sort of a transvaluation where instead of the hammer and the sickle, it's now Twitter and the iPhone. So how, just from your experiences on the project, how did your subjects reconcile being members of this communist ideology while living in completely capitalistic societies?
Wow. That's kind of a tough question. I mean, obviously, they're not enthusiastic about it. I mean, if they were, they wouldn't be a member of the Communist Party. I would say in a lot of cases, there's a lot of nostalgia involved. I already mentioned that in the context of Russia. Of course, for the Italian communists also, there's nostalgia about the time when the Communist Party was so strong and big, although their influence was very limited because they were never allowed to become member of the government. I would say that India, or the state of Kerala in India, and Nepal are kind of different examples. Kerala is being ruled by a coalition led by the two communist parties. And there's nothing exceptional about that. You could say that since 1957, the communists have been more or less in and out of the government. One election, the Congress Party would win, the next election, the communists would win, etc., etc. And in practice, I would say they are more like social democrats. There's nothing revolutionary about them. They are trying to improve the situation of the workers, of women, and they are very limited because of the huge problem that we all have, I think, which is that the economy is global. But politics is still local, meaning that if the Kerala Indian Communist Party managed to get better minimum wages, they run the risk that the companies will just simply move to the state next door, to one of the Indian states or abroad. I think that is, of course, how we are all being blackmailed, basically. But still, that's what they're trying to do. So they are, I think you could say, they're part of the political establishment. They are a normal political party, a left-wing political party. Do I hear a dog, or is that...
Yeah, that's a cameo appearance from my puppy Brody. I'm If you hold on just 1 second, I'll bring him in here and try to tame him down a little bit. I apologize. Hold on 1 second.
Yes, sir.
Brody, come here, Brody. Brody. Come here, Brody. What you doing? Okay, I get you. Come here. All right, hold on. And here's my pride and joy. Yep. There we go, Brody.
What have you got there?
Yes,
Okay.
It's my beloved 7-year-old Bichon Frise. My favorite continental European breed. All right. Okay, can you calm down for a minute? I'll take you out as soon as we're done, okay? All right.
I guess you're talking to the dog and not to me, right?
Well, you know, things can get a little kooky here. All right, so yeah, just moving along with the project there in Red Utopia. Obviously, these are real political parties. I think it's a little bit different from what you see in the U.S., where there are many self-avowed communists all over the place. You can go to any college campus and find them. But to me, they're not really...
Let me interrupt you. I have been considering to include the U.S. Communist Party. In fact, I had a nice conversation with the chairman of the party in New York. But my conclusion was that it was so small and there were so few offices that it wasn't worth it. I think it could be worth an interesting article. I think it's the strange paradox or the strange situation of being a communist party in the center of capitalism is intriguing, but photographically it was not a lot.
So I think really the important thing to sort of address there is that the subjects in your project, they're legitimate political parties. They actually have an ambition of getting political power. Whereas in the U.S., I think it's more along the lines of they're just sort of like a Marxist literature fan club, to where, you know, they enjoy the ideology, but they're not really trying to implement any of the, you know, social policies of Marx or Lenin.
Well, that's not realistic because they are so small that they don't stand much of a chance anyway.
And just from that, I think the most common canard I hear about communism from communism supporters in the U.S., not that I talk to a lot of them, but I have interviewed several of them, is this idea that true communism has never been tried. And that's generally used as sort of a excuse to kind of explain why you have Pol Pot and you have Mao and you have Stalin. So I'm interested in wondering, you know, how your subjects felt about that. Do they believe that communism has never been implemented in its truest form, or and that explains sort of the atrocities been committed under Stalin and Pol Pot and those guys?
Yes, I think so. Yes. Yeah, I think the answer is plain and simple yes. There may be a few exceptions. I remember talking to an Italian feminist who said that under no circumstances would she have wanted to be a member of the old Communist Party, the big old Italian Communist Party, because she didn't agree with their line. But in general, yes, I think in fact it's hard to be a member of a Communist Party if you don't adhere to that idea, because then you have to accept that that there were all these huge-scale murders, executions, repression, etc., etc. So yeah, you stick to the idea that real communism has never materialized. An open question is, I think, to what extent can you compare this to to several religions? I mean, has true Roman Catholicism ever been realized? There's a nice, they have a nice history of repression and quite a bit of murders as well, of course. So yes, I think generally that's what people say, and my answer to that would be: look, if you have had so many chances to realize it, and all these chances have led to nothing, maybe there is something inherently wrong with it.
And of course, the name of the project is Red Utopia, so I'm curious, what do they envision a communist utopia to actually resemble?
that's really hard to say in general terms. Again, I would say it certainly differs from country to country, but it probably also differs from person to person. Again, for the Russians, for a lot of the Russians, it was probably going back to the old days of safety and security, in their opinion. I think in the case, well, for example, if you look at southern Italy, there is youth unemployment in some places of 60 to 65%, and these can be people that are well educated. I came across members with a PhD who are unemployed or may have 1 or 2 months a year of work. So what they want is a better division of wealth, which I could totally agree with. But I think in the end, it's probably even a private matter. One person will have a very revolutionary idea, and for the other, it is a way to make sure that there is work for everybody and a decent minimum wage.
And what can you tell us about the demographics of the Communist Party? Was it primarily younger or older, male, female? What are some of the details there?
Russia, old, very few young people. Every once in a while, an unexplicable younger businessman. And I have not been able to figure out why. Why would such a person be member of the party? Well, maybe the competition is member of the other party, of let's say Putin's party, so he joins the enemy of the enemy. Italy, this mix of really old but a lot of young people. Well, a lot. I mean, it's a small party. But in that small party, yeah, I think a fairly wide, fairly representative demographics with a lot of young people. In Kerala, yeah, also young, old, everything. Nepal, same, I would say. Portugal, I didn't see enough to make a really good judgment, but I think more old than young. Anyway, so many young people in Portugal have emigrated to work up north. I mean, in more northern countries, there aren't that many young people left. So again, differs from country to country.
And what would you say is the number one appeal for people who join these neo-communist organizations? Is it just an anti-bourgeoisie revenge fantasy, the result of socioeconomics, or something a little bit deeper?
Well, I think it's deeper. I would say justice. Justice, economic justice in the first place. I think a lot of these people are shocked by the unfairness of neoliberalism and are even willing to do something for it. Sometimes, in my opinion, rather useless. I mean, what's the use of holding a demonstration in a Russian small town with 20 or 25 people? It's kind of desperate. But I have a lot more sympathy for people who, in Italy, for example, would on a Sunday start providing vegetables to the local poor. Mm-hmm. So really actively trying to do something, small scale, but very practical. And nice. I mean, at the same time, you can, I don't know what, sit on your couch and watch TV or whatever, or drink, but they would do something for others. Yeah, so I just feel sympathy for that.
And how long did the project take you from pre-production to actually getting the thing out in print?
I think we have a dog company again.
Oh, we do. It's time for the mailman. So my apologies. He's
Never mind.
He's quite vocal. All right.
Yeah, he is. Maybe you should interview him.
I have to edit out the profanity, though. That's the problem.
Okay. What was your question again? Oh, yeah, how long it took. I started in 2013 in Portugal. My one and only trip, at least communist trip to Portugal. And the last photographs were done in Russia last year, May, June. And in between, a lot of time was spent on trying to figure out where communism still played a role. So myself and a friend who used to work as a journalist have been investigating again almost all continents, trying to figure out where communist parties still play a role, where they still exist and have some size.
Yeah, I'm still here. I promise.
The dog isn't, is he? Oh, the dog is too.
He is. I have to comfort him for this one. Okay. And obviously, when you have a project that goes on, for such a long period of time, you're going to have some memorable moments. So, what was your favorite aspect of doing the project, and was there a most poignant or revelatory moment for you during Red Utopia?
Well, I can certainly give you a very nice anecdote.
Oh, I'd love to hear that.
Again, from Russia. It's important to say that the translator with whom I worked in Russia is a friend of mine, and what is important is she's a woman. So at some point we came to a small town in Western Russia, and our visit started with the local chairman giving us medals. We both got a medal, a small speech, as a token of their appreciation of us visiting them and doing this project, etc., etc. And not only was the chairman present, but also 2 other male members and 2 female members. And after the small speech, the local chairman said, well, now we have to celebrate this. And there came the bottles of vodka and brandy, etc. And my translator said, look, wait a minute, I can't drink, which is not true. I know she likes drinks, but in that occasion, she didn't want to drink. And I said, look, I still have to drive, so I can have 1 vodka, but that's it. Now, that didn't stop 2 of the gentlemen from happily boozing away, which was fine by me because I had to set up my lights and I did something kind of experimental. It became kind of a film noir atmosphere there, so it's kind of tricky to set up your lights like that. And so I needed time to prepare, and in the meantime, they were discussing things with my translator, who's called I, and talking about the war and how the war had influenced the lives of their fathers, their uncles, and this uncle had died, and that uncle had been killed or tortured or whatever during the war. And in the meantime, 2 of them were getting pretty drunk. The 2 women were sitting there and looking very skeptically and trying to somehow control the situation and at least make these 2 gentlemen not misbehave too much. And the 5th person was kind of, just sitting there more or less, slightly embarrassed and for the rest dreaming away. And the 2 men were just boozing and boozing and boozing. At some point, one of the guys went out, and it was clear he went out for a smoke. And I occasionally smoke a cigarette, so I thought, hey, I'm going to join him and steal one of his cigarettes. So that's what I did. And he spoke a little bit of English, and he had been telling us that he was in the Russian army. So he'd been fighting in Chechnya and Afghanistan. And when we were outside smoking, he suddenly said, yeah, I've just returned from Ukraine, where I've been fighting also, which I thought was quite spectacular, because Putin is denying that the Russian army is involved in the Ukraine, and here is suddenly this this member of the Russian army, half drunk, happily admitting that they are there. So that was kind of remarkable. And after the cigarette was smoked away, I came in and I was about to tell this remarkable story to my translator when she said, Jan, I think it's better if you don't go out anymore. And I said, but what's wrong? What happened? And she said, well, the moment you closed the door behind you, the drunk chairman was kissing me on my mouth. And she almost smacked him. So she had her own Me Too experience there in that case. Of course, the women were even more embarrassed and etc., etc. But, well, yeah. I guess that was the most remarkable situation of the lot.
Will Dutch and Russian international relations ever recover? All right. And is there any sort of central message or a big takeaway that you hope the readers and viewers of your work walk away with on Red Utopia?
Well, what I'm trying to do with my work, not just Red Utopia, but in general, is I'm hoping to raise questions more than giving answers. So ideally, with my projects, I manage to confuse people, to send mixed messages. And the reason is that I think we all want to solve confusion, and we try to solve it by using our head, by thinking. And I think if I manage to stimulate people to think, to use their brains, that is quite a wonderful result. Now that's putting it, of course, very broadly and very generally. In the case of Red Utopia, I would love people to rethink their opinions about the division between rich and poor and how we have organized our society in that sense.
And do you have any upcoming gallery dates you want to promote?
Sorry, upcoming what?
Gallery dates.
Upcoming gallery dates. Yeah, but not really close to you.
Oh, we have an international audience. We're good.
Okay, good. Well, the big exhibition here in Holland has just finished. I'm having a retrospective in the Photo Museum in The Hague, where Red Utopia will be shown next to all these other projects that we discussed. There will be a show of Red Utopia and my project Law and Order in the museum in Mannheim in Germany. And there are several other venues that we're talking with at the moment, possibly in Rome, Museo di Roma in Trastevere, and there are other candidates, but what I just said, that is fixed.
And we talked about this off the air. Do you want to go into any sort of details about your upcoming projects?
Well, what I could say is that I have been offered an artist in residency in Air Serenbe, if that's how you pronounce it. Air Serenbe or Serenbe. You can probably tell me how to pronounce it.
Yeah, it's Serenbe.
Serenbe, okay. So I hope to be there for at least a month between mid-May and mid-June of this year. And what I want to do is, well, it's still unclear, but let's say I want to delve into the story of a woman who has been incarcerated for 25 years now on the accusation of murdering her 3-year-old daughter. And I plan to delve into that visually and maybe in other ways as well. But it's still not very concrete. I still don't know exactly how that's going to be. But anyway, I'm going to spend a month there. I may come back if need be, and that all depends on the grant that I hope to get from a Dutch, let's say, a National Endowment for the Arts in Holland here, the Mondriaan Fund.
And of course, this project is happening in the Metro Atlanta area. So I'm sure we won't end up, reconnecting like Werner Herzog and Klaus Kinski.
Yes, I think so.
Hopefully with less fistfights on set, but we can try.
Yes, we will.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you so much for taking time to talk to us today, Jan. So we're going to do a quick outro here. I'll just let you plug any of your websites or social media profiles you'd like to lead our readers and listeners to.
Okay, well, the website is very easy, www.janbanning, B-A-N-N-I-N-G, and by the way, Jan is J-A-N, so janbanning.com, and Facebook, you just look for Jan Banning or Jan Banning Photographer, both are my Facebook pages.
And where's the easiest place to pick up Red Utopia?
At the moment, from my website, but it's a co-production with the US publisher Nasrali, and pretty soon it should be available in the US as well. But for now, go to my website, and even if it's available in the US, I'll put it up there.
All right, so now I'll let you have the final word. Anything you want to say about not just Red Utopia, but anything going on in the world you think needs to have a little bit more attention put on it?
Well, maybe this is a kind of a ridiculous remark, but I wish we would all work on getting our society a bit more just than it is right now. A bit more empathy and a bit more understanding would help, but also some political measures to make this gap between rich and poor, between the happy few and the unlucky many, a lot smaller.
Once again, we here at Not Economically Viable would like to thank Jan Banning for taking time out of his busy schedule to talk with us about Red Utopia. If you're hankering for more info on Banning's latest project, or perhaps want to pick up a copy of Red Utopia for yourself, feel free to mosey on over to janbanning.com or friend him on Facebook at facebook.com/janbanning. And as always, we just want to remind you that all Not Economically Viable episodes can be streamed and downloaded for free over at noteconomicallyviablepodcast.wordpress.com. Well, that's all we've got for you this week. Take care, and we'll be doing this all over again very, very shortly.